Welcome back, everyone. This week we'll be talking about Chapter 24, which is on extinction. The 6th edition BCABA-TCO item that we will be covering is G18, which is to develop and implement differential reinforcement procedures with and without extinction. Actually, the topic we'll be focusing on is just extinction, but you will get differential reinforcement in the next chapter, which is Chapter 25. So before we get started, I want to do like a knowledge pre-check because extinction is a topic that you all have already been exposed to in EAB3002, and you've also heard me talk about it here and there within this course as well. So the first question that I want you to take a moment to respond to is, what is extinction? And then the next question that I want you to take a moment to respond to is, what is the annotation that we use for extinction? Or more specifically for a discriminative stimulus that signals that extinction is the schedule that's currently available. I want to start off this presentation by making a distinction between the two types of extinction that we have within the field of applied behavior analysis, okay? In your EAB3002 course, you all learned about respondent conditioning, which or respondent behaviors, which respondent behaviors are those behaviors that are reflexive behaviors or they're involuntary behaviors. You learned about the unconditioned stimulus eliciting an unconditioned response. That's an example of a reflex, and that's involuntary behavior. Now, once you learned about involuntary behavior, you also learned about how that behavior can be conditioned you can basically condition different stimuli or neutral stimuli in the environment. You can pair those neutral stimuli with a unconditioned stimulus, and then eventually you can get that neutral stimulus to become a conditioned stimulus, which then elicits the conditioned response. Okay, so this is, you all had an entire course, well, not an entire course, but you had a big chunk of a course that was dedicated to teaching this topic, okay? And if you recall, when you were learning about respondent conditioning, you also learned about respondent extinction, which respondent extinction is when you no longer pair that conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. And so what happens is there's an unpairing of sorts, and the conditioned stimulus is no longer going to elicit the conditioned response. So when the conditioned stimulus is no longer paired with the unconditioned stimulus, we see a gradual reduction in the conditioned response, okay? This is an example of respondent extinction. Now, this is respondent extinction. Now I'm going to cover an example of this with you. And this is a personal example. I have a cousin that when he was younger, he would love to get tickled. And one thing that we always did to him was we would do wiggle fingers, which you can see demonstrated here. So prior to tickling him, which the tickle itself is considered the unconditioned stimulus, and then him laughing in response to that is the unconditioned response. So we tickle him, which elicits the unconditioned response of him laughing. Well, we used to also do wiggle fingers to him. So we would wiggle our fingers, and we would be far away from from him in a room. Let's say we were by the door and he was sitting on the couch, and we would start from far, far away, wiggling our fingers from very far away. And then over time, and we would then walk up to him, and then we would tickle him. Well, over time, the wiggling of the fingers on its own began eliciting that response of him laughing. So what this means is that the wiggling of the fingers became a conditioned stimulus that was eliciting the conditioned response, which is the laughing. Well, as he got older, he's an adult now, but as he got older, it didn't seem so appropriate to keep tickling him, and so we would just do wiggle fingers, and for some time just the wiggle fingers alone would elicit the laughing, but because we stopped tickling him, the wiggle fingers alone now does no longer, this little wiggle fingers no longer elicits the conditioned response, so he's no longer laughing. So this is an example of respondent extinction. Okay, so I want to just make sure, like I said, that we're making a distinction between respondent extinction and operant extinction, which is what we are going to be focusing on during today's presentation. So operant extinction is when we apply extinction to our operant behaviors, and operant behaviors are those behaviors that are voluntary. We've throughout this course, throughout your EAB 3002 course, you've been hearing about antecedents, behaviors, and consequences, and how we can use consequences to change the future frequency of behavior. That's what we are referring to when we are, or that's the type of behavior. The voluntary behaviors are those type of behaviors that we are referring to when we are going to apply operant extinction. So those type of voluntary behaviors are called operants, or operant behavior. Okay, so operant extinction is applied to voluntary behaviors. It's a consequence that's delivered contingent on a behavior. So all it is, operant extinction pretty much is when you have a previously reinforced behavior that no longer results in reinforcement. That's pretty much the gist of what it is for operant extinction. And there's more that goes into it, of course, but that's like the basic definition of operant extinction. So again, what I wanted to highlight is that these two procedures, respondent extinction and operant extinction, are completely different procedures that we implement for the different types of behaviors that we as humans or as organisms engage in, okay? When you hear the term extinction alone, typically you can assume that we're referring to operant extinction. So throughout the presentation for today, as I mentioned, we're going to be focusing on operant extinction. There's nothing on respondent behavior in this presentation except for this slide. Throughout the presentation, you're only going to hear me use the term extinction. Anytime you hear the term extinction in behavior analysis, if it's not specifying whether it's respondent extinction or operant extinction, you can assume that we're referring to operant extinction. It's extinction of some voluntary behavior that we engage in, and we're manipulating the consequence delivered contingent on that behavior. So that's something that I want to clarify, and that you should also work to remember. Okay, so as I mentioned, this presentation is going to focus on operant extinction, and then you don't have to worry about this right now. This is just a little sample of an extinction graph. You'll get some more of that in an upcoming slide. So in a little bit more detail, what is extinction? Extinction is a behavior change tactic in which a behavior that has been previously reinforced is no longer going to receive reinforcement, okay? So the behavior can still occur. We are just withholding the reinforcer. What results is that the behavior is going to reduce in the future frequency, or whatever dimension of behavior we are looking at. Maybe the duration reduces, the magnitude reduces, whatever it might be. But the general idea is that once an extinction procedure is implemented, we see a reduction in the behavior. And then this should be a review for you all, but you have learned about the discriminative stimulus for extinction in previous courses. The discriminative stimulus for extinction is the S delta, or the S, or you could see it denoted like this, S delta or S delta. And the S delta is simply a discriminative stimulus that signals that reinforcement will not be available for engaging in a specific or a particular behavior. And if you recall, we have different types of discriminative stimuli. We have our discriminative stimulus that signals when reinforcement is available. We have a discriminative stimulus for punishment that tells us, when punishment is going to be implemented for engaging in a particular behavior. Well, our discriminative stimulus for extinction, which lets us know an extinction schedule is in place, is the S delta. Okay, so I want to clarify a few things about extinction. Extinction is, like I said, when we are withholding reinforcement contingent on a behavior. Contingent on a behavior means that the behavior has to occur, and then after, the consequence that's implemented for engaging in that behavior is that no reinforcement is provided, or that the reinforcement is withheld. Meaning that extinction is terminating the response to reinforcement relation so that the response is no longer producing reinforcement. Okay, so the response can occur, and actually has to occur for it to be considered an extinction procedure, but it's simply not going to contact reinforcement. One thing that I see often is that people confuse extinction with other procedures. Like, for example, they'll confuse extinction with punishment. In extinction, we are not blocking or preventing the behavior from occurring. It's quite the opposite. In extinction, the behavior has to occur, and what simply happens is the organism does not contact reinforcement. That's all it is. So now let's talk about what extinction looks like. I mentioned to you that extinction is a behavior change tactic, but it's also a process, and it's a naturally occurring process that happens in our day-to-day lives. And it's also a procedure that can be implemented in a very systematic way. Okay, so I want to give examples of, what extinction can look like in our day-to-day lives, because people often think that ABA is an autism treatment. I hear it referred to this quite often. And it's not. I've talked about this before, and I'm sure you've heard other instructors mention this. Applied behavior analysis is not just a treatment for individuals with developmental disabilities, but rather it's something that's naturally occurring in our day-to-day lives that has been studied, and these are simply the principles that guide our behaviors. Okay, so extinction is naturally occurring in our day-to-day lives. I'll give you some examples of that in the next slide. Okay, so here is a real-world example of extinction. This happened to me, sadly, this week, where I got into my car, I went to turn my AC on, and unfortunately, my AC was broken. So I would press the button and the AC would not turn on. And this is an example of extinction because traditionally, when I get into my car, I press the button for turning on the AC and the AC turns on. Now I got into my car, I'm pressing the button and the AC is simply not turning on. So that means that I am engaging in the behavior of trying to turn on the AC, but there's no reinforcement being provided. What happened, and I'll give you my real world example of how, of what I did, was I started pressing all of the buttons. I started pressing the heater button, I pressed the off button, I started pressing the button to increase the fan speed. I started opening my glove compartment to see if there was something wrong with my AC. I called my partner and I said, my AC is not working. Maybe you can call a mechanic. And I started engaging in all of these other responses. But the key here and the reason why this is extinction is that I was pressing the button and the AC was not turning on. What would happen is eventually I would continue to press the button. Nothing's happening. I'm not receiving reinforcement, which the reinforcer for that behavior was I would press a button and the AC would turn on. Well, now since that's no longer happening, I stopped pressing the button. And I started engaging in other forms of behavior that would hopefully, and that's called behavioral variability, that would hopefully result in some form of reinforcement for me. But in this case, I did not contact reinforcement. And so, we stayed without the AC working. And my behavior of pressing the button was placed on extinction or was extinguished. And so I stopped pressing the button. So that's a real world example of extinction. Okay, so here's another real world example of extinction. And this is, again, not extinction being implemented as a procedure. Okay, so you broke up with your partner, and so you decide you're no longer going to answer their texts or their calls. You want to go no contact with them. What is their behavior going to look like? Well, their behavior traditionally of contacting you resulted in a form of reinforcement in the sense that you would respond to them. Maybe, if they sent you a text, you would respond to them. If they called you, you would answer the phone. And so now you broke up with them. You want to go no contact. You no longer want to continue responding to their messages. That's an example of you placing their behavior on extinction because it's a behavior that previously resulted in reinforcement and is no longer going to contact reinforcement. What will happen is you'll see that behavior of calling and texting you increase in frequency. They might start engaging in other behaviors that will hopefully get your attention, just in hopes to be able to contact that reinforcer, which the reinforcer in this case is you speaking to them or you giving them some form of attention. Okay, so why are they calling more and why are they texting more? This is an effect of extinction. And we're going to talk about those different effects of extinction later in the presentation, but these are all classical effects of extinction. Just like how I mentioned in the previous example, with the air conditioning, that I started engaging in variable responses or in different responses, different response topographies. Like for example, I saw that my AC wasn't turning on, and so I started opening the glove compartment and tried to see, well, is something wrong with the AC? Then I was contacting my partner. Then we were contacting the mechanic after, and these were all different responses that I wouldn't typically engage in had I not been met with extinction, which is the withholding of reinforcement. The same applies here in this example, and actually in all examples of extinction, where we will see response variability. We'll see an increase in the frequency of behavior and the magnitude of behavior. Behavior often intensifies when we contact extinction in our natural lives, or when we implement extinction as a procedure. So again, we'll talk about all of the side effects of extinction in an upcoming slide, but this is an example of some of the side effects of extinction. Okay, so there are two different types of extinction, I guess forms, we could call them, two different ways of implementing extinction that we have seen in our field. The first one that's described in your textbook, they call it procedural extinction. And it's a form of extinction that was often applied in the field when we first got started in the field. So I guess it was like a misconception of how extinction should be applied, or what extinction should look like. So Vollmer and Athens conducted a study or a literature review in 2011, and they noted that when the field first got started, there was a presumption that behavior was always maintained by attention. Therefore, when a practitioner wanted to implement extinction, they were taught, well, to implement extinction, all you have to do is just ignore the behavior and it will go away. So this is actually an incorrect thought process, and it's a form of extinction that they identified as a procedural form of extinction. So that's what they refer to this as. So here's an example of a procedural form of extinction where you're taught to just ignore it, which is not what extinction is or how extinction should be implemented, okay? So here's an example from your textbook. Moira is disrupting her class often. The teacher usually asks her to calm down, and she provides attention in different ways. And then what happens is the behavior continues occurring because, Moira is potentially engaging in the behavior of disrupting her class in order to gain attention. And so now what the teacher does is that he no longer provides attention contingent on the disruptions, and so the behavior stops occurring after 4 days. So in this case, this example that they gave, the behavior is actually maintained by positive reinforcement in the form of contingent teacher attention. Okay, so in this example, the behavior is maintained by attention. And so, implementing an extinction procedure where you're withholding attention would make sense. Okay, but not all behavior is maintained by attention. Okay, so that assumption that if there's any form of problem behavior occurring, that we should just ignore it is an incorrect way to apply extinction, and an incorrect way to think of extinction. And actually, it's very harmful to the field. It's very harmful to the clients that we're working with to assume that any behavior that they engage in just deserves to be ignored. That's not correct, and it's a misapplication of extinction. And I think it also brings the point of it highlights like an unethical application of extinction, right? Because we're not considering our clients' needs by just ignoring them as a person. And an extinction procedure is not simply a procedure where we ignore the person. It's not about ignoring a person. It's about ignoring a behavior. And I should clarify. When it's a behavior maintained by attention, sure, we can ignore the behavior. We are never going to be ignoring the person. Okay. That's not really correct to do. Okay, so defaulting to just ignore it as a method for applying extinction will not withhold the reinforcer maintaining all forms of problem behavior. So if the behavior is maintained by another consequence, not attention, then we need to align our intervention to be function based. Okay, so we'll look at what that looks like on the next slide. Okay, so then what is best practice for treating behavior? The best practice is always going to be to start with an assessment to identify the function of problem behavior. Okay, so we talked about this pretty extensively in the first few chapters of this course, right? You talked about conducting a functional assessment of behavior, what that looks like, and how that leads to the identification of the function of the problem behavior. Now, if you decide after conducting an assessment of problem behavior and determining the function of the behavior, and after you've considered contextual fit and what's socially appropriate for the client and what the caregivers can reasonably do, what's appropriate for the setting, etc., after you've considered all of that, if you decide that extinction is going to be a recommended treatment, because it's not always a recommended treatment, then you should make sure that you are matching the form of the extinction procedure to the function of the problem behavior, meaning that your extinction procedure should be function based. Okay, and I also want to clarify, in the past, I think in the way that ABA was done in the past, oftentimes when we had a behavior that was maintained by escape, we would say, okay, let's withhold escape. When we had a behavior that was maintained by attention, we would say, okay, let's withhold attention. And that's not always, the go-to intervention. You don't always have to resort to extinction, which is why I'm saying if you decide that extinction is an appropriate intervention, then you want to proceed by making sure that your extinction procedure is matching the function of the behavior. If there are always going to be other alternatives, and it's your responsibility as the BCABA, or maybe it's the responsibility of the BCBA. Maybe you are not responsible for the treatment planning, but in some cases you might be. It's your responsibility to identify what is the appropriate intervention for that client. Okay, so let's say that you do want to implement an extinction procedure and the behavior is maintained by attention. What would that procedure look like? We just talked about it earlier. So we said that Moira is disrupting the class to gain teacher attention, meaning the function is attention. In this case, what would be a functional form of extinction? So I want you to take a moment and think about what the functional form of extinction would be if the behavior in this case is maintained by attention. Again, consider that with extinction, you're withholding the reinforcer that's known to maintain that behavior. So think about what's the reinforcer here, and then go ahead and consider what extinction would look like. Okay, so in the case of extinction for a behavior that's maintained by attention, we would simply withhold attention contingent on the occurrence of disrupting, okay? You're not going to block the disrupting from occurring. You're going to continue to allow that person to engage in that maladaptive behavior, that problem behavior, but you're simply not going to provide attention contingent on the behavior. So the behavior is maintained by attention, therefore the behavior should go down because it's no longer contacting attention. Okay, so now what would extinction look like for a behavior that's maintained by negative reinforcement? And this could be a behavior that results in escape or avoidance of some aversive stimulus. So here's an example. Moira is disrupting class to get out of doing classwork. So in this case, what would be a functional form of extinction? And remember, it's important to clarify what is the reinforcer that's maintaining that behavior. In this case, it's escape. And so we would want to withhold escape or avoidance of that, of basically getting out of doing work. Okay, so what's going to happen is Moira can continue to engage in those disruptive behaviors, but her classwork won't be removed. She has to, that demand is going to remain in place. That aversive stimulus or that aversive condition will remain in place. And so Moira no longer gets to avoid task completion contingent on disrupting, and what will happen is we'll see a reduction in disrupting. So this procedure that we just discussed in the previous slide has a specific name that we use within behavior analysis. This is called escape extinction. Escape extinction is when extinction is implemented for behaviors maintained by negative reinforcement, where basically the behavior does not produce the removal of the aversive stimulus, meaning the person cannot escape the aversive stimulus by engaging in the problem behavior. It's just a procedural variation of extinction that's applied to behaviors maintained by negative reinforcement. That's all it is. So when we say escape extinction, we're referring specifically to those extinction of those behaviors maintained by negative reinforcement. Okay, another procedural variation of extinction would be extinction that is applied to those behaviors that are maintained by automatic reinforcement. And first, I want to clarify what automatic reinforcement means, because this will look different for every single learner. So there is a researcher, Rinkover, that in 1981 took the time to describe what a sensory reinforcer is. And they described it as a stimulus that sounds good, feels good to the touch, looks good, tastes good, smells good, or the movement itself feels good. Okay, so again, sensory reinforcement or automatic reinforcement is going to be different for every single learner. And sometimes it can be very challenging to identify what specific what specific stimulus is maintaining that behavior. Sometimes it can be difficult to know, let's say, for example, a person that engages in hair twirling. Is the behavior being maintained by the sensation of the hair being twirled in the person's fingers? Is it being maintained by the hair pulling, the sensation of the hair being pulled on the scalp? Is the behavior of hair twirling being maintained by the physical appearance, like the visual aspect of having the hair twirled at the end? Is it being maintained by a combination of these things? It's difficult to know. So our first job as behavior analysts, if we are trying to put a behavior on extinction that's maintained by automatic reinforcement, would be to try to pinpoint what specifically is maintaining that behavior, right? Which part of that of that behavior looks good or feels? Is it that it looks good? Is it that it feels good? Is it that it tastes good? What specifically about that behavior is it that's maintaining that behavior? And then next, this isn't something I included on the slide, but you want to consider, is this a behavior that's appropriate for targeting for reduction? Okay, you can have many behaviors that are maintained by attention, like, for example, the behavior of hair twirling that I just mentioned. I twirl my hair all the time, and this is a behavior that's maintained by automatic reinforcement. Now, the big question is it a behavior that's worth targeting for reduction? And so I usually consider, is it a behavior that's interfering with the client's ability to socialize? Is it a behavior that's interfering with the client's ability to learn? Or is it a behavior that's damaging to the client in some way? And if it's not, then I don't work on that behavior. There's no social significance for targeting that behavior. But if I answer any of those three, if my answer to any of those three questions is yes, then we might want to consider targeting that behavior for reduction. And maybe the procedure that we decide on is extinction of the behavior in the form of, withholding that automatic reinforcement that sensory stimulation that they're receiving. Okay, so the extinction procedure for a behavior maintained by automatic reinforcement will simply look like trying to mask that sensory consequence or trying to withhold that sensory consequence that they're experiencing. Okay, so in the example of the behavior of hair twirling that I just gave to you, let's say that I twirl my hair because I like the sensation on my fingers of hair twirling. Then maybe wearing a glove would mask that sensory consequence for me. Meaning I can still engage in the behavior of hair twirling, but it doesn't feel good anymore. And so because it doesn't feel good anymore, what will likely happen is my behavior of hair twirling is going to be placed on extinction, and I'm no longer going to engage in that behavior. So that's an example of an extinction of a behavior maintained by automatic reinforcement, and I have a few others for you here on the slide. So another example is, let's say that you have a behavior of pencil tapping. A person excessively taps their pencil on the table. Maybe it's hundreds of times to the point where it interferes with that person being able to complete a task. Maybe it disrupts them from learning, and so you decide that you want to target this behavior. Well, the first step would be, again, identifying what about that behavior is maintaining the behavior. And if it's the sound of the pencil tapping or the feeling of the pencil tapping on the table, well, we could try to pad the table with something soft and squishy to see if the reduction in noise and the reduction, in the tapping would, well, the tapping itself will continue to occur, but in the sensation that's received once you tap, if that changes, then maybe we can get the behavior to stop occurring. That would be an example. If we're able to withhold those two reinforcers, then that would be a good example of extinction of pencil tapping. The other example that I have here is, let's say that you have a client that engages in the behavior of flipping a light switch on and off repeatedly, let's say hundreds of times, to the point where it competes with them engaging with peers, to the point where it competes with them with engaging in other stimuli in the environment, with learning, etc. Let's say it's a behavioral excess, okay, that does interfere with several aspects of their life. Then we can consider targeting that behavior. And maybe one way we can, let's say that the behavior is maintained by the visual stimulation of seeing the lights turn on and off. One thing that we could do is, if we wanted to implement an extinction procedure, would be to turn off the breaker. So, or disconnect the switch so that they can still switch the light on and off, right? They can still move the switch up and down, is what I mean. But the light itself won't be changing. It won't be flickering on and on. And so the learner can still turn the switch, but no reinforcement is provided. And so ideally, if the behavior is maintained by that visual stimulation of seeing the lights flicker on and off, well, then that behavior would stop occurring altogether. Okay, so now I want you to test your knowledge. What do you call extinction that is implemented for a behavior that is maintained by negative reinforcement? Do you call this avoidance extinction? Do you call this sensory extinction, attention extinction, or is it escape extinction? Okay, the response to the first question was escape extinction. Now I want you to answer the next question. What do you call extinction that is implemented for behavior that is maintained by automatic reinforcement? Do you call this avoidance extinction, sensory extinction, attention extinction, or escape extinction? In this example, for behavior that is extinction applied to behavior that is maintained by automatic reinforcement, we call that sensory extinction. Let's discuss now how extinction can often be either misunderstood or misused. We as behavior analysts have a responsibility to make sure that we're being conceptually systematic in the way that we are referring to the interventions that we're implementing. So if you are implementing an extinction procedure, then you want to refer to it as an extinction procedure. But if you're not implementing an extinction procedure, then you should also not be referring to the procedure that you're implementing as extinction. Okay, so in the next few slides, you'll see different ways in which we often either misunderstand or misuse the term extinction. So the first one says, using extinction to refer to any decrease in responding is one of the ways that extinction is often misapplied or misunderstood. So basically saying that the behavior is extinction when extinction wasn't even responsible for the reduction in the behavior. There are tons of procedures within behavior analysis that we can apply to help us reduce a behavior. Extinction is not the only one. Okay, so you want to, like I said, make sure that you're remaining conceptually systematic. think about what procedure did I implement and what's the name that corresponds with that procedure. Okay, so there are other procedures, like I mentioned, that we can use to reduce behavior. The first one is you can implement or set up an abolishing operation for a behavior. So let's say that we have a client that is often seeking out food. They're rummaging through the pantry. They are going into the refrigerator. They're stealing food from their peers, from staff members, etc. Well, one thing that we can do is we can just set up an abolishing operation, which would look like, pre-programming times in the day where they would get access to food, and basically just satiate the need for them going out and rummaging for food or stealing food or whatever it might be. Okay, so that's an example of us setting up an abolishing operation, which will result in the behavior reducing. It would not be appropriate to call this an extinction procedure, because an extinction procedure, like we've mentioned in the last few slides, is when you can still engage in the behavior, but the reinforcer is withheld, which is not the case with what I just described. Okay. Another way to reduce behavior would be to set up a punishment procedure where a behavior occurs, and contingent on that behavior, punishment is applied, whether it be positive punishment or negative punishment. Again, what I'm describing here is where the consequence that follows the behavior is the addition or removal of a stimulus, whereas extinction is withholding of a stimulus, of a reinforcer, a known reinforcer following behavior, which is not the same as punishment. And then finally, a procedure that also can result in the reduction of a behavior is when we reinforce an alternative behavior. So sometimes when we reinforce an alternative behavior that serves the same function as the problem behavior, we'll see an increase in the alternative appropriate behavior, and then we'll see a reduction in the problem behavior. If you didn't produce any change on the problem behavior, let's say that one continued to contact reinforcement, but instead you just had a very thick schedule of reinforcement, or a very dense schedule of reinforcement for the alternative appropriate behavior, what will result is you'll see an increase in that alternative behavior and then a decrease in the maladaptive behavior. This doesn't mean you applied extinction. Again, extinction is something very specific. It's the withholding of a reinforcer after a behavior has occurred. So the behavior has to occur, and then you withhold the reinforcement. They don't contact that reinforcer. Okay. Sometimes also people will confuse extinction and forgetting. In both of these, in both extinction and forgetting, the behavior reduces. But like I've mentioned, with extinction, you can engage in the behavior, you just don't contact reinforcement. Whereas with forgetting, you don't even have the opportunity to engage in the behavior. So with forgetting, really what happens is the passage of time plays a role in weakening the behavior. So because you don't have the opportunity to engage in the behavior, you basically forget, and that behavior is weakened over time. Another way that extinction can be misunderstood or misused is that people are confusing response blocking and sensory extinction. So as I mentioned, sensory extinction is the extinction when extinction is applied to a behavior that's maintained by automatic reinforcement, where we're withholding the specific reinforcer that we've identified as maintaining that behavior. Whereas response blocking is a punishment procedure, okay, in which the behavior occurs, and then contingent on that behavior, we're blocking. We're adding something to the environment that blocks the person from being able to continue to engage in that in that behavior. So an example of response blocking is where let's say a person engages in eye gouging. Eye gouging is like a behavior where the person like sticks their finger in their eye, and they kind of dig into their eye, and obviously that's a very harmful behavior that can lead to permanent tissue damage, can lead to vision loss. It can have very really negative impact on your client. And so it's a behavior that you really want to focus on reducing, and a punishment procedure would be an excellent procedure for such a severe form of behavior. And so we could implement a response blocking procedure where if the eye gouging were to occur, we provide a helmet, we apply a helmet to the individual. And so now they're no longer allowed to engage in that behavior. They cannot touch their eyes at all because the helmet is pretty much blocking their ability to engage in that behavior. That's an example of response blocking where we're even blocking their ability to continue engaging in that behavior. And that consequence was applied contingent on an occurrence of the behavior. Whereas sensory extinction is an example. I mentioned the hair twirling earlier. If I wanted to implement sensory extinction, I would put on a glove on a person. They can continue to twirl their hair, so the behavior of hair twirling can continue to occur, but they're not going to get that reinforcing sensation on their fingers. And so they can, like I said, they can continue to engage in the behavior, but they're not going to contact the reinforcer. And that's the key difference here. With response blocking, contingent on some behavior, you're implementing a response blocking procedure where you're stopping that client from being able to engage in other in that behavior again. Whereas with sensory extinction, you will withhold the reinforcer, and it could look very similar, but they can continue to engage in the behavior. They're just not contacting the reinforcer. And then lastly, people will often confuse extinction with a procedure, an antecedent manipulation procedure that we use in behavior analysis called non-contingent reinforcement. And you may have heard me talk about non-contingent reinforcement in one of the previous lectures, but you haven't had too much exposure to non-contingent reinforcement, but you will get more on this topic when you cover antecedent manipulations in the next course, EAB3794. So non-contingent reinforcement is when you have a behavior that's maintained by any reinforcer, and you identify what that specific reinforcer is, and basically you decide that you're going to provide that reinforcer non-contingently, means not following any specific behavior. You don't need the behavior to happen. Instead, what you're going to do is simply provide that reinforcer frequently on a time-based schedule, meaning that you're basically trying to satiate the need for the learner to engage in that particular behavior, the problem behavior. So you're going to deliver the reinforcer frequently throughout the day, and the learner never has to engage in the problem behavior because you've satiated the need for that reinforcer. So you're basically creating an abolishing operation, and so the behavior reduces. So I can give you guys an example of this. If you have a client that engages in throwing often, and throwing occurs maybe because of the sensory stimulation of, it could be the visual aspect of seeing an item be up in the air and then lands. If you have a learner that, let's say, throws an item hundreds of times, all items, hundreds of times per day, and it interferes with their learning, it interferes with their ability to play, to interact with peers, it could be harmful, because imagine if you're just constantly launching items in the room, that could be a dangerous behavior potentially also. And so let's say that you want to implement a non-contingent reinforcement procedure. Well, what you would do is you would pre-program specific times in the day where you would allow that learner or that client to engage in appropriate forms of throwing. So you would pre-designate times in the day. Let's say at 10 o'clock, we're going to go and throw some paper into the trash can. At 10:05, we are going to go throw balls into the basketball hoop. At 10:10, we are going to go play catch with the peer. And so they're getting access to that reinforcer multiple times throughout the day. And so what happens is you reduce the need for them to engage in problem behavior because they're accessing that reinforcer in another way throughout the day, meaning we're, like I said, creating an establishing operation by satiating that need. And so this results in the behavior being reduced in the future, which is different from extinction. So non-contingent reinforcement and extinction, although they both result in the behavior being reduced, are not the same procedures. And so you have to, like I said, make sure that as a behavior analyst, you're remaining conceptually systematic. What specific procedure are you implementing? And that you refer to it with the appropriate term. So again, I sound like a broken record throughout this presentation, but extinction is when you engage in the behavior, when your client can engage in the behavior still, but they're not contacting that reinforcer, which is completely different than what I just described with non-contingent reinforcement. Okay, so we have some more knowledge checks. So this question says, true or false? Extinction is the same as response blocking. Okay, so now I want to talk about, how we appropriately refer to extinction when we are speaking to individuals, okay? Whether we're speaking to a therapist or a family, how do we refer to the process of extinction? How do we refer to when a behavior has been placed on extinction, etc.? Okay, so let's say that you want to refer to extinction as a behavior change procedure. You can say, we used extinction to treat X, Y, and Z behavior. So basically, this is a table from your textbook that is explaining to you how you're going to use extinction across different scenarios or across different contexts. Next says, if you are going to refer to extinction as a behavioral process, you could say, Yoshiaki's callouts are undergoing extinction, or Yoshiaki's callouts are being placed on extinction could be an appropriate way to also say this. So this statement would be appropriate to say only if we know that that reinforcer that was previously maintaining the behavior is actually being withheld. Okay. You could also say extinction decreased Yoshiaki's callouts, which is referring to extinction as a principle of behavior. The statement is only correct if an experimental analysis demonstrated a functional relation between the extinction procedure and the decreased occurrence of the behavior. Okay, and now let's talk about how you can refer to behavior that has already been extinguished or has gone down to zero, is no longer occurring after a extinction procedure has been implemented. So you could say, for example, Audrey's second language skills have extinguished. She has not spoken Italian since her last language class 3 years ago. Okay, so attributing the lack of behavior to extinction is only correct if Audrey's attempts to speak Italian since her last language class have produced no reinforcement. If Audrey's Italian was weakened by the passage of time during which she had no opportunities to speak the language, then the statement would not be correct because it's not an extinction process that was demonstrated, but rather forgetting, right? She just forgot the language because of the passage of time and there were no opportunities to practice. Okay, next example says, if you want to discuss escape extinction, here's how you would discuss that. So because a functional analysis suggests that Lefke's problem behavior is maintained by negative reinforcement, I recommend escape extinction as treatment. When you present a task to Lefsky and she begins to engage in the problem behavior, physically guide her through the task, but do not let her escape from the situation. Okay, and the next example says, we have been extinguishing Jeremy's eye rubbing by blocking hand movements towards his eyes, and it's working. So in this example, you can see how they use the term extinguishing as a verb because they're referring to how the intervention is being applied. Okay, in the next few slides, we are going to begin our discussion on the effects of extinction and the secondary effects of extinction. So, of course, the main effect of extinction is that we'll see a gradual decrease in behavior, but that is not the only consideration. When you are implementing extinction, you should be considering that there are secondary effects of extinction, which are these here. And hopefully across the next few slides, I can drive home the point that you should be strongly considering whether these side effects of extinction are something that would be appropriate for your client, that your client or their stakeholders can reasonably accommodate, that this procedure is appropriate or not appropriate for your learner, for their setting, that you can manage the effects of the extinction procedure. And if you can't, then you don't want to implement extinction. So Those are all things that I want to discuss on the next few slides with you all. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit more about those secondary effects of extinction that I just introduced you to on the previous slide. Really, I think you should think of these as like a group of considerations, and don't think about each individually, rather than the possibility that any of these may occur and are likely to occur. So first we have the extinction burst, which is basically an immediate increase in the rate of response after removing a reinforcer. So you have your baseline, data. So let's say that you've collected baseline data for a maladaptive behavior. So this particular graph is showing the length of time a client engages in screaming in minutes. This is the baseline here. Then we add our phase change line, which is going to let us know when we are beginning our treatment. And so then here we begin the treatment phase, which is the extinction procedure. And so this increase in duration that you see here is the extinction burst that I'm referring to, okay? Where it's that change in the in how often the behavior is occurring, or in this case, it's the duration. So in the duration of a particular behavior, but you would expect that if I'm implementing a procedure to reduce a behavior, well, why didn't it just go down, right? Why didn't the behavior just go down? Well, that's because with an extinction procedure, we always will see, or almost always will see, the extinction burst, which is where the behavior gets worse before it gets better. So you see that peak where it increases. Notice how the baseline levels are over here, okay? And then the behavior actually increases. This is that extinction burst. And you have to be aware of all of the different behaviors that we may see during an extinction burst. So within an extinction burst, you're likely to see what we call extinction-induced variability, which is when basically we see different topographies of behavior that traditionally it was the specific topography that you're targeting that resulted in reinforcement. But now the learner or the client is going to try all these different forms of behavior to see which one is going to result in reinforcement. That's basically what it is. So if you recall the example that I gave you guys earlier, of the boyfriend that you broke up with, and so now they're texting you all of a sudden, and they're texting you very frequently, then maybe they're trying to call you, and when they don't receive reinforcement in those ways, right, I mentioned how that was an extinction procedure. If they don't receive reinforcement in those ways, they may try to contact you in different ways. Maybe they show up at your house. Maybe they contact your mom or a friend and they say, I haven't heard from Sarah. I'm concerned about her. I really want to speak to her. I don't want things to end this way. And maybe things start escalating and they engage in different forms of behavior that they wouldn't normally engage in, just to see if they can contact reinforcement, if they can get in contact with you. So with an extinction burst, you're going to see not just the increase in the rate of the behavior or in the specific magnitude of the behavior, but you're also going to see that extinction-induced variability, which is where we see different topographies of the behavior that we wouldn't normally see. A great example, actually, and I didn't include it in this presentation, and I should have, but a great example of extinction and the different side effects of extinction is when you put money into a vending machine and the vending machine does not give you your food, right? Traditionally, you put money into a vending machine and you press the buttons and immediately you get the food. And in this case, you put money into the vending machine and it did not provide you with the food after you made your selection. And so what do? Right? You start pressing the buttons a little bit more often and you say, maybe I didn't press the button. Maybe that's why. But then you see that didn't work. So maybe you tap on the glass a little bit and that didn't work. And so then maybe you grab the vending machine from the corner and you're moving the vending machine from side to side and that didn't work. So now maybe I'm going to try to kick the vending machine and that didn't work. And so at what point do you stop? That's going to be very personal to every single person. Okay, very individualized to each person. So I might have stopped at the like tapping on the screen. I'm tapping on the glass, but another person might be doing much more than that. They might be shaking the vending machine, kicking the vending machine, punching the vending machine, maybe trying to unplug the vending machine, contacting the vendor, etc. There's people that will go far beyond what your expectations would be with the extinction burst and the extinction induced variability. Okay, so it's very important that if you are implementing extinction, that you're aware of the possibilities, although we can't possibly imagine everything, but that you're aware that placing a behavior on extinction may evoke, okay, an extinction burst, or is very likely to evoke an extinction burst with these novel behaviors, because that's what an extinction induced variability is. It's novel behaviors that the person is engaging in. It's a form of response variation to see if they can contact reinforcement again. And then the third thing you need to be concerned about is that extinction it really is a procedure. You have to think about the ethics of implementing a procedure like this, because extinction leads to emotional outbursts and aggression in a lot of cases. Not always, but it's one of the secondary effects that is a pretty common effect, and it's not a procedure that feels great, right? I don't sound very behavior analytic there, but it's just, it's the truth. It's not a procedure that feels great for the people that are experiencing it. So I think that's an important consideration, especially when you're thinking about, how much backlash we as a field receive. I think extinction traditionally was the go-to intervention for many people, and now we should be thinking twice about whether there is a more ethical or a more compassionate intervention that we can be implementing. There is still going to be a space for extinction. You still will implement extinction, and you will honestly implement extinction in combination with other interventions in a lot of cases. And like I mentioned, extinction isn't just a procedure. It's also a naturally occurring principle of behavior. Okay, and so it's going to happen. You just have to consider whether there's any way to mitigate the effects of the intervention in some way. Okay, so I want to go back to the slide. So I want to make sure that you know that placing the behavior on extinction, or a behavior on extinction, may also evoke emotional outbursts and aggression. And you have to consider whether that's something that is manageable for the interventionist, for the family, for the caregivers, whether it's safe for the client, etc. In the example of the vending machine, an example of aggression would be aggressing towards the vending machine. And then in the example of a person that you broke up with and you are, carrying out an extinction procedure because you're not, maybe not knowingly, but you are carrying out an extinction procedure because you're withholding reinforcement from that person, which is contacting them, responding to their messages, etc. You have to be aware also that may result in an emotional outburst from that other person, and in a potential aggression from that other person as well. Okay, so let's continue with the secondary effects of extinction. So I mentioned to you all the initial increase in response magnitude. The graph that was actually displayed on the previous slide was a duration graph, and it showed perfectly how a behavior can increase in duration. So the magnitude of a behavior can vary widely. It can be, the duration of the behavior. It can be like a more intense behavior. Maybe if you're working on, like, let's say vocalizations, it can occur at a higher volume. Basically, any form of the behavior can be increased. The magnitude can be increased. Okay, so let's look through this graph really quick so that I can move on to talking about the next two secondary effects. So, like I mentioned, when you are beginning any intervention, you would collect baseline. So baseline is what the level of the behavior prior to any intervention or prior to the extinction intervention. In this case, the behavior was obviously being reinforced, was contacting reinforcement, because if a behavior is in a person's repertoire, then that means that it is contacting reinforcement. Okay, so this is baseline data. And then we have our phase change line, which lets us know that we're moving into a different phase. And so that phase in this case is extinction. So we begin implementing the extinction procedure and we see our extinction burst, okay, which it's very likely that here we had some of that response variability, possibly an increase in response magnitude, possibly some extinction-induced aggression or extinction-induced emotional outbursts, okay? Those are all possible during extinction bursts. And then what we typically and traditionally see is that after the behavior has worsened, we see the improvement. So the behavior will go down to 0, okay? So here we see that the behavior has reduced. One common side effect of extinction or secondary effect of extinction is that we may see after so here is where the behavior has been extinguished. I want to highlight this point here. So here in this particular case is where the behavior has been extinguished. They don't have any numbers on the y-axis, so it's a little bit hard to tell, but I'm assuming that they left. Sometimes they do this, but they'll leave a space, and this is actually 0 here. And they'll do that too, so that you can see the data. Okay, so here that we'll assume that the behavior is extinguished, meaning the behavior has gone down to 0 and it's no longer occurring. Well, we have this phenomenon called spontaneous recovery, which is when we have a behavior that has already been extinguished and that behavior now begins to occur again. So here is an example of spontaneous recovery. And it's important that when the behavior recovers in this way, it's usually very temporary or short-lived, as long as you continue to implement the extinction procedure. Okay, so just make sure you do everything as you've been doing it, that the behavior does not contact reinforcement, because if the behavior does contact reinforcement, instead of seeing this short-lived, peak and then it goes back down to 0, instead, if you reinforce the behavior when it occurs here, what will happen is you'll see the behavior shoot back up. Why? Because you reinforced that specific instances of behavior, rather than being consistent with your implementation of the extinction procedure. We also have another effect, which is called resurgence, and it's very similar on a graph to spontaneous recovery. It looks exactly the same actually on a graph. The only difference is that resurgence is when you have a reoccurrence of a previously reinforced behavior when you begin reinforcing an alternative behavior. When the reinforcement of an alternative behavior is terminated or decreased. So you will have, let's say, a specific topography of behavior that you were reinforcing, and it's an alternative behavior to the maladaptive behavior, but now that behavior is no longer resulting in reinforcement, or in this case would be being placed on extinction. And because that behavior is being placed on extinction, like I said, you're going to see novel forms of behavior, or you're going to see response variation. And so because of that response variation, you're going to see an increase in the specific behavior that you were targeting. And it'll look very similar to spontaneous recovery on a graph. The only difference is that, again, this happens because there was a change in the reinforcement for an alternative behavior. So in this case, again, you are going to remain consistent implementing your extinction procedure. If you don't remain consistent and you accidentally reinforce the behavior, you are going to see recovery of that behavior. That's what we would call that. That behavior is in a recover, is going to continue to occur again. It's been reinforced, and so now then you have to go through the entire extinction procedure again. Okay, and here we have another example of extinction being implemented. So let's look at this graph really quick. And the graphs I showed you previously were like these beautiful graphs, and that's not always the case when we're implementing an extinction procedure. So I want to make sure I highlight this graph. So first we have our baseline here, okay, and our level was around here for baseline. Okay. The behavior here in this case is self-injurious behavior, SIB, which in the field of behavior analysis, we use the letters SIB to denote self-injurious behavior. So here's our level of self-injurious behavior during baseline, and then we begin our extinction intervention, and we see the classical extinction burst, which is where the behavior increases. We went from about a level of around, I don't know, three responses per minute of SIB until the extinction procedure was implemented, and now we have around 12 responses per minute occurring, more or less. But very quickly, as long as you maintain the extinction procedure, you'll see a reduction in that behavior. Okay, this person was more resistant to extinction, and so they are kind of, we're seeing some variability here. The behavior got down to 0 level, but it is continuing to occur. So that's what we call resistance to extinction. And then we finally see the behavior was extinguished. Okay, this is what that that extinguished behavior will look like. It goes down to 0 levels. Here we saw a tiny little, it's kind of hard to see, but it's there. Either spontaneous recovery, probably in this case, spontaneous recovery. And then the behavior goes back down to 0 again. Okay. And then now this is common in behavior analysis where we will reverse back to baseline just to make sure that the effects of our intervention are from our intervention alone and not because of any other variables. And so we'll reverse back to baseline, and we typically will expect to see the behavior go back. We want to be able to turn a behavior on and off. And so, having a baseline phase and then an intervention phase and then reverting back to baseline, we should see the behavior turn back on, basically. Okay, so in baseline, we saw high levels of the problem behavior. In extinction, we were able to manage to extinguish the behavior. And then when we introduce baseline over here again the second time, we see the behavior increase again, which is typically what we would want to see during a baseline to tell us that the intervention was effective. And so what we do then, obviously, it wouldn't be ethical to leave a person engaging in self-injurious behaviors, and so we would implement the intervention again. So we go into our next treatment phase. Let me see if I can erase this. Okay, I can. And then we would want to see the behavior reduce again. And notice how when you implement extinction a second time, okay, for the behavior, we don't see that huge extinction burst. You can, but traditionally, once a behavior has been placed on extinction and then it begins being reinforced again, that second time when you go through the process of extinction, the behavior actually will extinguish much quicker, because the person has a learning history where they already are familiar with the conditions. They know that the behavior hasn't been reinforced, and so they're more likely to respond faster to the extinction procedure. So we see that behavior go down over here much sooner than the first time that extinction was implemented. Notice how many sessions, okay, it took here to extinguish the behavior the first time, whereas look at how quickly it happened the second time. And notice that the extinction burst didn't really happen in this case. Okay, and then we can see the same thing with aggression here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop this. Okay, so now let's talk about some important considerations about extinction. And I'm sure, as you've been hearing me talk about the different secondary effects of extinction, you've probably had some of these thoughts yourself. Okay, so when you're implementing extinction, you have to consider whether the secondary effects of extinction are something that will be manageable for the person that is implementing the procedure or those people around them. Okay, it's not only the person implementing the procedure, but also everyone that's going to be in the environment when you are implementing the procedure. Okay, because imagine that you're, in a school setting implementing an extinction procedure, and you experience the extinction burst with the response variation and an increase in response magnitude, are any of those behaviors going to be harmful to the people that are around the client? Are they going to be harmful to the client themselves? Is the behavior manageable in that setting? You want to consider whether people in that environment may reinforce any of those behaviors, because that's also something you don't want. You don't want any behavior during an extinction burst, any of the novel responses that are occurring during extinction to be reinforced. Because traditionally what we see within an extinction burst is we see worse topographies of a behavior sometimes. We see more severe forms of a behavior sometimes. And so the last thing you would want is to reinforce any of those topographies of behavior and for you to have a bigger problem than what you started with, okay? So the first things first is the behavior, is the extinction burst something that, the extinction burst and everything that comes with the extinction burst, is that something that's manageable for the setting, for the people in the setting? Are you sure that people won't be reinforcing the behavior, etc.? Also, we have to consider if we're going to see more severe forms of a behavior in some cases, we have to consider whether that's safe for the learner or not, for the client or not. And then another thing is making sure that we have trained all of the people in those settings. You know, if you're implementing an extinction procedure at home, that you've trained caregivers, that you've trained staff, any siblings, whoever it might be, on how to also implement extinction so that they're not inadvertently reinforcing a behavior. Because the last thing that we want, like I mentioned, is for a behavior in an extinction burst to be reinforced, because what's going to happen is you're going to be shaping up. If we reinforce a behavior at the extinction burst, or if we reinforce a novel topography of a behavior, what's happening is we're shaping up a more severe form of a behavior, a more severe topography of behavior potentially, or more intense. Let's say we're targeting aggression. Well, actually, we probably wouldn't use this with aggression. You can, I guess, but you might end up shaping up a more severe form of the problem behavior. And that obviously is not what we want, and it raises ethical concerns. And so you need to be very cautious when implementing an extinction procedure. So typically, if I'm considering an extinction procedure, which extinction is not one of my go-to interventions, but like I mentioned, there's a time and a place for extinction, and it's also a naturally occurring principle, and so that it's just in some cases going to happen naturally. If I'm considering an extinction procedure, I will traditionally ask the families that I'm working with whether this is something that they feel they can manage, whether it's something even emotionally that they're ready for. Because some families won't be ready in that particular moment, or they won't be ready at all. Some families will tell you, you know what, I'm not okay with seeing my child engaging in severe forms of problem behavior or experiencing those emotional reactions. That might not be something that is tolerable for them. And so in those particular cases, you have to think of a different intervention. Even though maybe your professional opinion is that the extinction intervention would be the most effective, maybe it's not something that's a good fit for that family. And so then you have to consider other interventions. Our job and our role as behavior analysts is not to come up with the perfect, most beautiful plan on paper that we know is going to work, but rather to come up with an intervention that's a good fit for the family, for the client, considering all the different variables that will play a role in each case. Excuse me. One example of an extinction procedure, I don't know, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. When some infants are being sleep trained, one recommendation that we hear often is to let them just cry it out, the cry it out method. And that's not something that many families are okay with. You'll speak to many mothers and they'll say, I'm not okay with just letting my child cry it out. And I think with good reason. You know, for some families, that's not a good fit. I think there are other sleep training methods I'm not a sleep training expert at all. And so this is kind of outside of my area of expertise, but I'm just bringing to you the example of the cry it out method for sleep training, that many families are not comfortable with that. And that pretty much is an extinction intervention, where you're not, the baby was used to crying and the caregiver would come and would pick them up. And now that the caregiver is no longer going and picking them up in the middle of the night when they're crying, they're instead just letting them cry it out until eventually the baby falls asleep. That that same idea applies to other behaviors where not necessarily an intervention that's being applied for sleep training, but maybe for another behavior where you're considering extinction. The parent might tell you, look, I can't tolerate hearing my child scream. And so if they can't tolerate hearing their child scream or cry for whatever reason, then extinction would be a procedure that they're not likely to implement well. And so if they're not likely to implement it well, then you definitely don't want to be running an extinction procedure, because like I mentioned, the risk of implementing an extinction procedure and the behaviors getting worse is very high. And so then you don't want for the caregiver to, in the middle of an extinction procedure, in the middle of an extinction burst, tell you, you know what, stop, just give him exactly what he wants because I can't handle this anymore. And then in that particular case, what we've done is we've inadvertently reinforced a more severe topography of behavior, or a behavior with a higher magnitude, whatever it might be, and we've shaped up more severe behavior. And so we've basically taught that child or that client, you have to cry for X, Y, and Z time, and then eventually you'll get what you want, or whatever it is, whenever the specific behavior was reinforced, we've now taught that client, this is what you need to do the next time that you want to gain access to reinforcement. And so the next time that if you ever try to implement an extinction procedure, the extinction burst will be much worse because you've reinforced a behavior at the tippity top, once they've engaged in a severe form of the behavior. We've reached our next response check. And so the question is a fill in the blank, and it says an increase in behavior frequency or intensity after extinction is implemented is called a blank. Okay, so the correct answer here is an extinction burst, which an extinction burst can include any of those different effects that I mentioned previously. Okay, so now we also have some other considerations to make when we are implementing an extinction procedure, which is that our extinction procedure might not be effective right away because there are some factors or some variables that will contribute to a person's behavior being more resistant to extinction, meaning it'll take a little bit longer for their behavior to reach that 0 point or to be extinguished. So I don't know if you recall the graph that I showed you all earlier, where the behavior wasn't like, the graph was not like this perfect graph where we see the extinction burst and then we see the reduction, it goes down to 0 and it remains at 0. If you recall, in the treatment phase, the data kind of were like this. So I'll draw my little graph here. Oopsies, I'm sorry. Okay, that's better. We have our data. Let's say we have a behavior that's occurring around these levels for baseline. Okay, and then we implement our extinction treatment phase. Extinction, EXT. Okay, and we see the behavior go up, and then instead it starts going down, but instead of going down, it really remains kind of like this for a while until eventually it finally reduces to those 0 levels that we wanted to see. Okay, this is what we refer to as resistance. Let me clarify what I mean by this. This here is what we refer to as resistance to extinction. It wasn't that perfect, beautiful graph that we've seen before, right? This perfect, oops, that's not a great color. Okay, this perfect graph where we have the baseline, and then we have our extinction intervention, and it goes down, and then that's it. You know, it just goes down to 0, and we don't see any of this response variability. Well, this is known as resistance to extinction, which is when we see continued responding during an extinction procedure. 3 measures of resistance to extinction is that we will see a declining rate of response, which is what we've seen here. We did see a declining rate of response, okay? The total count of responses emitted before responding ceases or attains some final low level. So we did see that eventually it reaches some final low level. And then the duration of the time period required for the behavior to reach a predetermined criteria, it basically takes a little bit longer for it to reach that level that we were hoping to see. Okay, so that's a resistance to extinction. And we're going to talk about what contributes to that, or how, why is it that some behaviors take longer to be extinguished? Okay, so one major contributing factor to resistance to extinction is that a behavior is placed on an intermittent schedule of reinforcement rather than on a continuous reinforcement schedule. So behaviors that are placed on a continuous reinforcement schedule prior to an extinction procedure are going to be extinguished sooner because the reinforcement was consistent. The learner knew exactly what to expect. You know, every single time they engaged in the response, they received reinforcement. They engaged in the response, they received reinforcement. They engaged in the response, they received reinforcement. Now, with the treatment phase, that where the behavior is in a contact extinction, the change in the schedule is much more apparent. And so it's quicker for them to pick up on the fact that there's been a change in schedule and that now the behavior is not being reinforced. And so the response to extinction is much quicker. And basically the behavior is extinguished much sooner. Whereas if you have a behavior that's been intermittently reinforced prior to the extinction procedure, so during that baseline phase, the behavior is sometimes reinforced and sometimes it's not reinforced. Well, what's happening is you're creating an unpredictable schedule of reinforcement for the client. And so because they don't know when reinforcement is coming, once you implement that treatment phase, the extinction phase, it's difficult for the client to discriminate that change in schedule. Okay, so it's harder for them to realize, okay, I've gone from an intermittent schedule of reinforcement to now an extinction schedule. And so it takes a little bit longer for them to pick up on those schedule changes, meaning that they're going to continue engaging in behavior at the same rate that they were during baseline, because it's not as apparent that they're on a different schedule of reinforcement. Okay, so intermittent reinforcement may produce behavior with greater resistance to extinction than behaviors previously reinforced by continuous reinforcement. Some intermittent schedules may produce more persistent responding during extinction than others. The thinner the schedule of reinforcement, the greater the resistance. So you all may not be familiar with that language, the thinner the schedule of reinforcement. You're like, what does that mean? In behavior analysis, we use, when we're talking about schedules of reinforcement, you can say a schedule of reinforcement is a dense schedule of reinforcement, which means that the learner is receiving reinforcement very frequently. And so, like, for example, a variable ratio of 2, which means that on average, after every 2 responses, they're receiving reinforcement, is a more dense schedule of reinforcement, whereas a thinner schedule of reinforcement is a learner that is only receiving reinforcement, let's say, on average after every 40 responses. Can you look at the disparity between 2 versus 40? So for the learner that's on a thinner schedule of reinforcement, the resistance to extinction is going to be much greater. It's going to take a lot longer for the behavior to actually be extinguished because, like I mentioned, this change in the schedule of reinforcement is going to be much less apparent to the client. It's going to be harder for that person that's on the VR40 schedule, where they're only receiving reinforcement on average after every 40 responses. It's going to be much harder for them to realize that now they're no longer going to contact reinforcement, and might take 100 responses. It might take 120 responses. It might take 200 responses before they finally realize, wait a second, reinforcement is not coming. My behavior is being placed on extinction. And then they stop engaging in the behavior. And so definitely, if you want to place a behavior on extinction, having a more dense schedule of reinforcement, or even better, having that behavior be placed on a continuous reinforcement schedule is going to make the extinction procedure much more effective, or you'll be able to extinguish the behavior sooner than a behavior that was being previously intermittently reinforced during the baseline phase. Okay, some other factors or variables that may affect resistance to extinction would be motivating operations. So, of course, if you have a learner that is highly motivated to gain access to that reinforcer, then you will have more resistance to extinction. Okay, if it's a really valuable reinforcer, you're also gonna experience greater resistance to extinction. So let's focus on the motivating operations first for a moment. Let's say that you have a learner that's highly motivated to gain access to that reinforcer. They're not gaining access to that reinforcer in any other way. Then you will have a harder time implementing extinction. That learner will respond more often during that extinction phase, and you'll probably take a little bit longer to extinguish the behavior. Okay, so whenever possible, as I've mentioned, extinction doesn't have to be a standalone intervention. You can implement extinction as part of a treatment package where you're combining it with other interventions. And so if possible, if it's okay to find a different behavior that can result in the same reinforcer, then that will help your behavior be less resistant to extinction. Okay, and then the next one says number, magnitude, and the quality of reinforcement will affect the resistance to extinction. So a behavior that has a longer history of reinforcement may be more resistant to extinction than a behavior with a shorter history of reinforcement. This just has to do with mostly like a learner coming to expect a particular reinforcer for a behavior. If they have consistently engaged in the same behavior for years, and they have been contacting that reinforcer for years, it's going to take a lot longer to extinguish a behavior than for someone that just began engaging in a behavior a week ago, and they don't have a long history of reinforcement with that behavior. So you're more likely to see quicker the behavior be extinguished much sooner with the person that has a shorter history of reinforcement. And then next, which I briefly mentioned, the magnitude and the quality of a reinforcer will likely influence the resistance to extinction. If you have a very high quality reinforcer for a particular behavior, it is much harder to extinguish the behavior. And if it's kind of like a reinforcer that's like, it's a moderate reinforcer, it's not such a high quality reinforcer, then the behavior can be placed on extinction much sooner. Or will be extinguished, not placed on extinction, will be extinguished much sooner. Okay, the next variable that will affect the resistance to extinction is one that I already briefly talked about when we were covering the graph. I showed you the reversal back to baseline, and then when the treatment was reintroduced again. And I showed you all how the resistance to extinction was much shorter with the second time that we implemented extinction. So basically, this next variable that's going to affect the resistance to extinction tells us that when we have implemented extinction already once before, and we have a behavior that begins occurring again, whether it be because the behavior came back through spontaneous recovery, or whether it be because we reverted back to baseline, whatever it might be, whatever the reasoning might be. Once a behavior has been placed on extinction once, any successive application of extinction will lead to a less resistance to extinction, meaning the behavior is going to decrease more rapidly the next time that you apply extinction. Okay, so you're not going to have as much resistance to extinction than the first time that you applied the extinction procedure. And then another variable that affects the resistance to extinction is the response effort for engaging in the behavior that you are targeting for reduction. So a response that requires greater effort is going to diminish more quickly during extinction than a response that requires less effort. Now I want you all to take a moment to please answer this next question, which is, which of the following is most likely to make a behavior more resistant to extinction? Is it A, reinforcing the behavior continuously, B, a short reinforcement history, C, the using punishment procedures, or D, reinforcing the behavior on an intermittent schedule? Okay, now let's talk about what you should do as a practitioner to implement extinction appropriately and in an effective manner. Number one, as I mentioned to you guys at the start of this presentation, one of the first things that you want to do when you are considering any intervention is to take a moment, assess the behavior, and identify the function of that behavior. During that whole process of assessing the function of the behavior, you should identify all the specific reinforcers that are maintaining a behavior. And we do have some behaviors that will be maintained by just one reinforcer, and then we will have other behaviors that are maintained by multiple reinforcers. So you can have a behavior that is maintained by attention and escape at the same time. And so when you're implementing an extinction procedure, you want to make sure that you're accounting for all the different reinforcers of a behavior and that you're withholding all those known reinforcers. Because if you implement the extinction procedure and that learner is still contacting reinforcement in some way, what's going to happen is you are not going to see the effects of extinction because that person is still receiving reinforcement for the behavior, meaning the extinction procedure is going to be ineffective or it's going to be minimally effective. And so you're not going to see that behavior go down to zero. Which leads me into my next point, which is that when you're implementing extinction, you want to make sure that you're withholding reinforcement consistently. So in the example that I just gave you guys above, the behavior is still contacting reinforcement. And so, as I've mentioned, when a behavior is still contacting reinforcement, it's going to continue to occur. And that also drives home this point that you need to make sure you're withholding reinforcement consistently, because what the opposite means is if you're not withholding reinforcement consistently, and that means that you're intermittently reinforcing the behavior, and intermittently reinforcing a behavior is going to be making that behavior more resistant to extinction. And so obviously we don't want that. So just make sure that you are being consistent and that people in the environment are being consistent with the implementation of extinction. Okay, next, to continue to make sure that our extinction procedure is effective, we want to make sure that we are combining our extinction procedure with other procedures. So as I mentioned, extinction does not have to be its own standalone intervention. We can incorporate extinction as part of a treatment package, and oftentimes this will look like us implementing extinction and also reinforcing an alternative appropriate behavior that will allow that learner to still access that reinforcer, but they're going to access it for engaging in an alternative behavior that is appropriate. So if we combine extinction with other procedures where a behavior is being reinforced, we're more likely to have an effective, to be able to effectively extinguish a behavior, basically. Okay. Some other things that we can do to make extinction more effective is to use instructions. So we can simply describe exactly what we're doing with the learner. Okay, you can just say, we're no longer gonna be providing reinforcement for this, for engaging in this behavior. Let's say that they engage in tantrums to get out of doing work. You can say, look, we're no longer going to be reinforcing this. You wouldn't use that language, but you would say, now when you engage in a tantrum, we're not going to be able to provide you escape from work. Instead, you can request a break. Let's say that if you were going to teach an appropriate alternative behavior, you can tell them exactly what the contingency is. I call these contingency statements, so you can let the learner know what's the contingency that's at play. If they engage in X response, you're not going to receive that reinforcer that you're used to receiving. And if you're pairing this along with another intervention, then let them know how they can access the reinforcer. If you engage in X, Y, and Z behavior, here's how you can get the reinforcer instead. And often when you do this, when you describe to the person the procedure that you're implementing, you're more likely to see a rapid reduction in the behavior. Okay, you also want to make sure that you're planning for extinction-induced aggression. I would say planning for any of the side effects of extinction are going to be important, because these are behaviors that are likely to occur and can be severe sometimes. And so you want to make sure that everyone's prepared for the different behaviors that you might see with extinction. And then also you want to make sure, like I said, any of those novel behaviors that might occur with extinction or the extinction-induced aggression, none of those should be reinforced. Okay, we're not trying to shape up any of these other maladaptive forms of behavior, so you have to be very careful. You also want to make sure that you increase the number of extinction trials. This is a recommendation where basically you want to contrive opportunities for, this is a recommendation from your textbook, where basically you want to contrive opportunities for the learner to engage in the maladaptive behavior more often or in a shorter period of time, so that they have the ability to contact the extinction procedure, and basically we can see the behavior be extinguished sooner because they are contacting the contingency in a shorter amount of time. And so they can basically learn the contingency and their behavior will be reduced sooner. And this will look like, if let's say there's a specific SD, you could set up SDs in the environment so that they're more likely to engage in the behavior, and then you would see the behavior reduce much sooner rather than waiting, across several days. Maybe they only engage in the behavior once each day, and it takes weeks to maybe like a week or two to see the behavior be extinguished. Whereas if you within one session are able to contrive 6-7 opportunities for the person to engage in the behavior, they're more likely to pick up on that change in the schedule of reinforcement, and then the behavior will go down much sooner. Okay, where was I? Okay, the next one says to include significant others in extinction. I've been mentioning throughout the presentation that this is important. You want to make sure that everyone is trained on how to implement the extinction. I mean, this is a critical component of extinction, I would say. If you have people in the household, like if it's a grandmother and grandmother never participates in sessions, but grandmother is going to be present, then the grandma needs to be aware that you're implementing an extinction procedure, because the last thing that you want is for grandma to barge into the room and say, well, what's going on? And, maybe say, oh, just give him whatever it is that he wants, and then you reinforce the problem behavior after the client is in the middle of an extinction burst. And so we're reinforcing a much more severe form of the behavior, and so we don't want that. So everyone has to be on board, and everyone has to be trained on how to carry out extinction. Okay. The next one is that we want to maintain the extinction procedure even after the behavior has been extinguished. So this kind of goes hand in hand with the previous one. You want to make sure that everyone is consistently implementing the extinction procedure, no one's reinforcing the behavior, and that they're aware that the behavior can recover. You can experience spontaneous recovery, you can experience resurgence, and so if the behavior does come back, they need to maintain the extinction procedure. They cannot reinforce the behavior. Okay. And then the last one is to guard against unintentional extinction. And this is referring to behaviors that you don't intend to be extinguished, accidentally being placed on extinction. Sometimes we have appropriate behaviors that we do want to target for increase, or that we do want the learner engaging in, and we accidentally may end up placing those on extinction. And so we definitely don't want that. So we want to put safeguards in place to prevent that from happening. Okay, we are on our second last slide. So I've been mentioning throughout this presentation that there are certain situations in which using extinction is not going to be appropriate. So I just want to, go back to some of these to kind of finish off our presentation. So Number one, you're not going to use extinction if the behavior is harmful. There are some, and not only if the behavior is harmful, but also if you expect very severe forms of the behavior or severe topographies of the behavior during the extinction burst. If you don't think that those are manageable, don't implement extinction. You also don't want to implement extinction if all sources of reinforcement cannot be withheld. So I mentioned if there are multiple reinforcers and you can't withhold some of those, don't implement the extinction procedure. The behavior will be intermittently reinforced, and then you are creating a behavior that's more resistant to extinction, which is the opposite of what you would be trying to achieve. Okay. You also don't want to implement extinction for a behavior where you need the behavior to be reduced very quickly. Okay, an extinction procedure takes time. You might experience resistance to extinction. The behavior has to get worse before it gets good. And so if you are looking for a rapid reduction in response rate, then this is not the intervention for you. And then you also don't want to implement an extinction procedure when you have others that are likely to imitate the problem behavior. So I mentioned earlier, if you're implementing an extinction procedure in a classroom, consider that the peers, you won't be able to control their reactions. You won't be able to control how they respond. And so you want to be very cautious who you're implementing the intervention around, because if there are people that are likely to imitate the problem behavior, well, then that's a concern. And also if there are people that will reinforce the problem behavior, then that also is a concern. And this isn't listed on here, but sometimes even asking I mentioned this already, but it's worth mentioning again. If your caregivers, if someone in the home, if the teacher, whoever it is that you're implementing the extinction procedure around, tells you this is not something that I think I can manage right now, I'm not ready to experience an extinction burst, I'm not ready for this behavior to get worse, because this behavior is already, very difficult for me to tolerate, don't implement the extinction procedure. It's okay. You can find an alternative intervention that might not be as, effective as quickly, or that might take a little bit longer for you to see progress with, but there are other options for reducing a behavior. And so you have to do what, you sometimes will have, like I said, the ideal intervention in your head. Exactly, in a perfect world, this is the intervention that I would apply and that I know would be effective. But we don't live in a perfect world. And so you need to make sure that you are tailoring your interventions to your clients' individual needs, to your family's individual needs, and to what they can reasonably accommodate. And then you'll see success with your interventions. There's going to be barriers in with every one of our clients, different barriers. And sometimes we have to just work around those barriers. There's going to be clients that extinction is simply not appropriate for. Okay, so now to end this presentation, I have some food for thought for you all. And I have 2 questions that I want to ask you. And then I'll give you my opinion. And, you can kind of go off and think about those things. But I often see that extinction is misapplied. Or I guess I saw this more in the beginning when I first started working in this field, and I don't see it as often now. People are much more careful now when implementing extinction, and actually people are much less likely to recommend extinction as an intervention than they were before. Whereas before, extinction was almost like the go-to intervention for some behaviors. And I think when people used to apply extinction, they would misapply extinction. Like I mentioned earlier, people, that Vollmer, and I don't remember the other author, in 2011 described what the 2 different types of extinction. They described one of those as procedural extinction. And they mentioned that procedural extinction was when people would basically overgeneralize the extinction and say that that extinction was a procedure that was, or no, they basically thought that all behavior was maintained by attention, and so the solution was simply to ignore the behavior. That was how extinction was previously applied. Well, my question for you all is, what if you have a behavior that's maintained by escape and you're implementing extinction? And if you have a behavior that's maintained by escape and you're implementing extinction, you're basically implementing escape extinction. What if while you're implementing escape extinction, your learner starts to, cry, or they are experiencing emotional reactions, should we just ignore the behavior? Should we ignore the client altogether? Okay, so this leads me to my second question. Extinction procedures often produce secondary effects, which some of which are emotional reactions. Will providing comfort to the individual reinforce a behavior that's maintained by escape? Okay. And providing comfort is like a form of, helping the client to de-escalate maybe. It's a form of attention that, of course, you would be providing. The behavior is maintained by escape. So do you think that providing comfort for a behavior, for those emotional reactions, those emotional responses, if those responses are maintained by escape, do you think that we would be reinforcing the behavior? Would this be okay? I want you to consider this because I think often people, when they're applying extinction and they do see these emotional reactions, they seem a little bit cold sometimes. They're not necessarily responding to the client and their emotional reactions. They're not responding to their emotional needs. They're not comforting them. And I think that makes sense if the behavior is maintained by attention. And if you've determined after giving it a lot of thought that an extinction procedure is appropriate, then of course providing attention for emotional reactions for a behavior that is maintained by attention would not be appropriate. You can, like I said, combine this with other interventions where we have an alternative appropriate behavior that we're reinforcing instead. That would be perfectly acceptable. But what about when you are dealing with a behavior that's not attention maintained, but rather it's escape maintained? It's okay, I think, in those situations to provide attention, because attention is not the reinforcer for that behavior. As long as you're sure that attention is not the reinforcer for that behavior, then providing comfort for those emotional reactions and helping that person to de-escalate is probably going to be okay. And it's also, I think, a humane and a compassionate thing to do. So I want you to consider that, in your practice. Give it some thought. Think about how the behavior, if the behavior is maintained by escape, providing attention for the behavior is not reinforcing the behavior. I mean, not for the problem behavior. I'm not talking about providing attention for the problem behavior. I'm talking about providing attention for those emotional reactions, for the, if they're crying, if they're sad, they're expressing, that like maybe they want this to be over, then you can let them know, this is going to be done soon. Here's the contingency. You can pass your little hand over their back, etc. Ask them, basically just try to comfort them, be human with them. I think this, in most cases, is going to be okay. But of course, you have to speak to the BCBA. You have to consider the function of the behavior, etc. And I will end the presentation with that. And actually, I'm going to end the presentation with a quote that I really like, that I've heard be used very often in our field lately. And it's by Maya Angelou. And it says, do the best that you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. Okay, we're not perfect. We as a field are growing and we're evolving. And it's our responsibility to learn about the interventions, about how to appropriately apply an intervention, about how interventions can be misapplied, about how we as behavior analysts can do damage to our clients, if we misapply interventions. And so it's our responsibility to do better for our clients, to know better. And so when we know better, we do better. That's, if you know something's wrong, do the right thing. All right, guys, I'll leave you with that. Have a great day, night, whatever it is, whenever you're watching this.